All right. If you are a realtor looking to turn your job as a realtor into a business, I am sitting here with Christine Marchesiello, who has 80 million sold in the past year and has sold 182 units with only 5 agents and 1 showing assistant. This is obviously not the norm. Welcome to the Freedom Chasers Six-Figure Strategies podcast. If you're an agent or an investor yet to hit 6 figures, this is the show for you. We take a deep dive into strategies to help you achieve the goal of 6 figures so that you could grow up to 7 figures eventually. If you want even more in-depth knowledge, sign up for a weekly mastermind for only $100 a month. That will be in the link below. Christine, super pumped to have you here. Could we just start it off with the epiphany that you had when you realized that you're probably working way too much and you wanted to turn your job into a business?
Absolutely. Well, I worked way too much for a very long time, way too long, unfortunately. But I had been selling real estate for about 10 years when this epiphany occurred. And I can't promise you that it was actually just a light bulb and it was all super easy. It was more of, um, oh my gosh, I'm literally so successful in making all this money, but I want to quit and take a $50,000 a year job. That's really hitting rock bottom, is what I call it. I had 2 little children at the time, and I just, really wasn't seeing them as much as I wanted to. And this is like so sad to repeat now, but like we actually, like with all this money I was making, we had bought a camp and we had bought a boat. And we actually named the boat Daddy Days so that my husband had something to do with my children while I worked all the time. So over time, it led me to this point in 2016 where I just kind of looked up one day and was like, I can't go on like this and I need to figure something else out, or I literally need to quit and just get a job.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. I mean, that's actually kind of something that happens often, right? You become successful in real estate and you end up kind of on the hamster wheel because you're always reactive and you're always running after the next deal. So obviously you had time crunches and it became a necessity, not something that you wanted to do, but something you had to do because you said you were considering leaving your job for, something less stressful for salary. So let's talk about the action steps that you did in order to start eliminating yourself from the job.
So again, this wasn't just one moment in time where all of a sudden it appeared to me what to do. This was several years leading up to the moment I knew I had to do it, was learning about teams and how to build a team and what the correct way to do that was. And I spent a lot of time really just diving into the learning side of that, just to kind of dip my toe in the water. I actually never wanted a team. I actually thought teams were a terrible way to sell real estate, right? So it's kind of interesting because that's just the perspective I used to have. But that's because I didn't really understand what a high functioning team looked like. I just saw more of what I would call groups in our market that were just running around like crazy, out of control, people just quantity, 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 not really doing things the way I considered to be best practice, which I thought only an individual agent could provide. But come to find out that as you get busier as an individual agent, you actually can't provide the level of service that you should be providing to your clients because you're just, running in all different directions. So I started learning about how to build a team and just the philosophies behind different teams. And I think that that was a critical point of having a successful team at this point, because I kind of set it up right from the beginning. I just didn't decide, oh, I want to have a team, so look at me, I have this big team, I'm so cool. It was really purposeful in the way about going about it. So that's what I would suggest first. Just really do your research and understand, what are my options when it comes to a team, because there are all types of different teams out there. So know that first. So that was kind of the first step, was just sort of researching the way I wanted to do it.
That makes sense. So you said something before I found kind of interesting. You mentioned that you didn't even want a team. That wasn't something that you wanted to do because it sounds like you didn't like the way a lot of other people were running their teams. Can I get a little bit more context there?
Yeah, I just, in our marketplace, it was really, there were no teams that I could look up to, really. I had to get to a national level to really start looking at high performing, high functioning teams where the team members were treated well. And if not, the focus over we call it rainmaker or the head agent, right? So I thought a team meant you had a big ego, if I'm being honest. I thought like those were the people that had teams. They have a big ego. They just want to tell themselves how great they are all the time. That was my perspective, and that was a wrong perspective, but at the time, that's just what I thought. And I really was very afraid of letting the customer service side of my business that I had built organically over 10 years go. And I really was attached to these ideas that no one can write an MLS description as good as me. Nobody could possibly take a photo. I was taking my own photos at the time. This was 2016. Like, I had a wide angle camera. Look at me. I had this great technology, right? Like, nobody could possibly take a picture as good as me. Nobody could edit it as good as me. Nobody. So I had all these lies that I was telling myself about all of the reasons why I could never have a team, because how do you possibly trust your most important work to somebody else? So really, that's why I had this negative opinion of what a team was from the get-go. So I had to work through that as part of the process.
So it's actually extremely common. When you're running a business by yourself and when you get started, you're doing everything, right? So you kind of get used to doing everything. And then typically when you hand off a task to somebody else, they're probably not going to do it up to your level, or if they do, it's going to take a fair amount of training. So let's talk about, you mentioned the limiting belief. I think you worded it differently, but we'll call it a limiting belief. So what helped you overcome that? Because I have unfortunately been a control freak too, where I hate giving tasks away because it's like, oh, they're not going to do it as good as me. So it's like, how were you able to overcome that thought process? Because I know it's super common out there.
It was truly just hitting that rock bottom and knowing that the only way forward was through. So I knew that I needed to commit to going slower to go faster for a minute. And I just came to that realization that that was the only way. I was at the point where, I was an individual agent. I was selling at that point about 65 houses by myself. Like I said, two small kids at home. Like, I could not sell another house without going insane. So I knew that that was the only way to try to push through that ceiling, was that I had to hire leverage. I had to get somebody to get some of these tasks off my back. And so it was just that there was no other option. And that's what initially led me down this path. So when I decided to hire my first assistant, I really, I think a huge mistake that a lot of people make is they go for the agent role first and they don't get their systems in order. And I think that that is probably the biggest fatal flaw of all real estate teams, is that they are afraid to make a salaried hire because, of course, they're afraid to, that's somebody that has to get paid every 2 weeks. And that's scary. Even when you're making $500,000, it's still scary to be responsible for somebody else's livelihood. But I think that that was one of the critical key steps that I did right, is hiring that administrative support first. So after I hired her and I really just spent, it was painful because it's hard for a real estate agent, right, to slow down and to really focus on systems. I mean, that's painful for a lot of us. But we spent those first 6 months building literally everything I did, taking it out of my brain and putting it into a system. How could she do it for me that was fail proof? And how could we checklist it? And how could we, make it really just run itself? And that's what we did. So we spent a lot of time building that, but that's a critical thing that you must do, I think, if you want to run a successful team. Um, you can never take on great talent in terms of agents if you don't have anything to offer them other than yourself and saying, look how great I am, come work with me. That's not going to last very long. So you're going to be a lot more successful with your agent hires that you bring on if you have a really strong foundation of tools and systems and leverage for them as well. So it's not just about getting you help, it's about setting your foundation of your team up.
Absolutely. So you're saying a lot of things here that I think are really important. Number one, when you chose to hire, you were already at capacity, right? So you had to hire. It was a necessity. You weren't hiring out of leisure. You weren't just like, oh, I'm going to hire somebody so I could do less work, because that could really become a challenge. And then you also mentioned, this is also very important too. You hired an administrative support before you started hiring more agents, because you had the foresight to know that the systems and processes are far more important than just adding agents, because the agents, if they don't have the support they need, they're not going to sell houses, or they're just going to end up moving somewhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You can't, one of the main reasons an agent joins a team, other than leads, they can join you for leads, but if you lead with leads, that's your value, then they're just going to leave you for the next person who has more leads than you. So you can't lead with leads or you better be prepared to do whatever it takes to provide more and more and more and fill that need for them, because what they join you for is what they'll leave you for, right? So it's much better to hire to some sort of system or value that can make their lives better as well faster, so that they can do more business faster and they can have the leverage that they need to, get to where you were in a third of the time or less. So that was really how I looked at it, and it did end up working out, wonderfully. But you can't make that first hire for freedom. Like, you're not gonna. That's not your freedom point. Like at this point now, where I am today, 5 years basically on that journey of starting to hire. This is freedom, but it's going to take you 3 to 5 years to really get there, to set it up right. So you can't get in your head like, I'm just going to hire, 2 more agents and 1 admin person, and then I'm going to wipe my hands of it and move on. I mean, you could, I guess, but that's not going to be your profitable way towards building a team.
Absolutely. It sounds so much easier than it really is. I could certainly promise you that. I mean, you could say that. It's like, I'm going to hire 2 agents and an admin, and I'm not going to do any work anymore. Unfortunately, that doesn't tend to work out that way. So let's talk about where you went next. So you hired the administrative assistant. You set up all your SOPs. How did you start growing from 0 to 5 then?
We got all of that stuff in place. And then, so you have to decide on what model you want to run your team on, because if you don't understand what your organizational chart needs to look like, you're just kind of hiring blind and there's no plan. And that's not a very good way to grow the team, because again, people just don't get that. They don't understand what you're doing. It's much easier to attract talent if you have a plan and you can show them where you're going and what your vision is. So I would say start with an organizational chart. So for me, that meant deciding on, I wanted to run a specialist model team. So I knew that if we were going to run a specialist model, that I wanted to hire a buyer's agent next. And that was literally just because I did want more freedom. I mean, obviously that was what we were doing here, was trying to get me back my life. And the assistant was great, but guess what happened? I hired the assistant, I had more time, and my business grew again. So like the end of that year, I was doing 80 transactions by myself. Now I had the assistant support, so it didn't feel like I was working anymore, but I was still at max capacity. So that was a nice thing, but at the same time, it really wasn't any leverage. So I knew the next step for me was a buyer specialist, because that was the time consuming part of my life, was showings and open houses and doing all that. So I figured, well, I can still handle listings, and this buyer specialist can take over the buyers. So I did have 2 failed hires. I mean, you're going to make hires, they're not going to work out. And that's okay. I think that's also one of the biggest things when you're building a team, is like, don't settle. Whatever your standard is, like, stick to it. Don't say, minimum standard. Like, your standard is your standard, and the type of person you want to hire is the type of person that you want to hire. I think a lot of people they fall in love with candidates, oh, you want to work on my team? Like, oh my God, don't do that. Like, really spend the time and vet people, and don't just take anybody that raises their hand. I think you really need to look for somebody who's going to be an extension of you. And so you need to put in that effort and find the right person if you want to succeed. My first buyer's agent is still with us today, and her first year, she sold 75 homes. So you can find that right person. Like, they exist and they will work on a team. I think a lot of agents too get in their head like, well, nobody great would work on a team. That's a lie. That is absolutely a lie. There are people out there that don't want to be you. They don't want to own a team. They don't want to run a team. They do want to be part of something. And they also want to make hundreds of thousands of dollars when they weren't going to do that before. So they exist. So that was our next step, was that buyer specialist. And that was the true beginning of having time. Like, I had weekends again. I was like, it was heavenly. Those couple of years was just like the sweet spot with just a couple of us. It gets more complicated as you grow, but with just the assistant and the buyer specialist, those couple of years were just beautiful.
I can only imagine. Did you feel weird at first when you had free time on weekends? Did you almost? Yeah, right. I could totally relate to that. Like, when I don't have a mountain of work to do, like, I get stressed out because I don't have work to do. It's like, oh my God, I'm supposed to be doing something, aren't I? That's awesome. So you mentioned those people are out there and you have to go find them. What does the hiring process look like then? Do you have personality tests, or what kind of things are you utilizing in order to find them?
We're crazy. And this might be too intense for a lot of people, but I mean, for me, it's all about trying to scare them away. And then if they stick around, like, okay, now we can talk. Like, I make my job description sound very scary. I make, I want to attract people that I call them the Super Bowl team. Like, I want people that want to be the best of the best, and they want to work for the best of the best, and they have that high drive and high desire to be that person, and they are attracted to high standards. So I start that from the beginning with our job description, and then we start with just a phone interview. You have to make it through that. If we're hiring for an administrative role, I mean, they're having tests just in their email grammar. I mean, I give them a step-by-step instruction. Send me this and this, take this test, do this. If they don't get those 3 steps right, they're not an operational hire. Like, there's no chance you're going to be able to work for me if you can't do the 3 instructions while you're applying for the job. So I think, being, like I said, being picky and being strict is an important part. But so we do a personality test. That's not a make it or break it. That's just a show me who you are naturally. Like, how do you show up? And then we do what we call a life story interview, which is kind of just like a resume, but we talk through, I want to see track record, right? So I want to see like that they've had struggles and they've pushed through them and basically repeated that pattern throughout their lives. So you can see that in people, even young people. They had a paper route, or they worked early and they, rose up through the ranks in somehow or way, or they were, a waitress and they absolutely loved it, and they, got energy from keeping track of everything. And there's just ways to see people's track record. And so that's an important part. And then we do kind of a motivational interview. Like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Like, people need to have big goals, or they're not going to be motivated to do what we need them to do here to meet our standards. So these are kind of like an evolving process. And then, they meet now multiple team members, but at the time it was just my assistant. She would kind of vet them, and she knew me and what it was like working with and for me. And so she would kind of see, like, are they going to be okay with this? Do they like structure? Are they driven? So, there's a process. It's not, again, a big mistake is just taking anybody who raises their hand as like warm blood.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with you there. You obviously can't take anybody that's breathing. That's not a winning business model at all. I love how you said you're trying to scare them away with the job post itself. And then you make them specifically jump through hoops. I'm curious. I mean, you mentioned the personality test isn't anything. There's a variety of them. Is there a preferred test that you guys use?
I work for Keller Williams as a brokerage, and we have our own. It's called a KPA. It's, an in-depth personality assessment. So I don't know what a comparable one on the market would be, but we do start with a DISC. So to me, if you're hiring for an agent role, it would be very, very, very rare to not have any sort of interpersonal, lead with interpersonal, or be a people person, or have some strong drive. So an I or a D type of personality. If you didn't have either of those, it'd be really hard to be successful as an agent. And on the operational side, there is absolutely no way that you can do that job if you don't have a C, which is just real, concise and details. And so that's the test I like to just take a glance at first, and then kind of move on to an in-depth. But of course, you want to see people that are highly responsive, that are, have some structure to them, have certainly drive. That's the biggest thing, I think, is, sort of a natural competitive drive on the agent side.
Absolutely. So let's dive into this a little bit, because I know a lot of team leaders that are afraid to hire high Ds because they're pretty often going to leave, or they're going to go work for somebody else. You often end up training them, and then they end up, doing their own thing. That doesn't seem to scare you at all, because you said you're looking for people highly ambitious and people that have drive. So let's kind of dive into that. Why doesn't that scare you like it might scare somebody else?
Without like risking offending anyone. If they feel that way, that's because they're afraid that they can't make their world big enough for that person. I mean, if your world can expand to fill somebody else's needs, then there's never going to be a problem with a high D personality, because they just want to go after something that they want, right? They can do it with you, or they can do it outside of you. But if you do things right, I mean, together you're going to achieve more than anything you could possibly achieve alone. So as long as you can grow your world to fit them in there. And what I mean by that is, like, for the buyer's agent, my first buyer's agent now runs her own team of buyer specialists. I don't meet with every single person, and that's an additional leverage piece for me. And it's also a growth opportunity for her. So, as long as you have an opportunity for somebody, then you shouldn't ever be afraid of a high D. They could take your business farther than you could ever dream of, even operationally. if you have somebody that's a high D, they've got to do their jobs first, but they could build a transaction coordination company. They could, I mean, it's unlimited. So high D is nothing to be afraid of. It's just going to push you faster and harder, and you have more responsibility to grow yourself so that they can, not outgrow you.
That was such a brilliant answer. I love that because you just have to you have to stay one step ahead of them essentially and make sure that you're able to give them the opportunity to grow because once they feel constricted, that's when they're going to leave. If they continue to have new opportunities and new training, they're probably going to stay. That was a tremendous answer. Thank you for that. And you really worded it well. So, I mean, I really think you nailed that. Um, cool. So now we have the agents, often high D, often ambitious. What kind of lead flow strategies are you guys utilizing now in order to keep them busy?
So, I mean, we have an organically grown business. And I think I mentioned this, and you're like, what do you mean by that? And it's just my business was so old, so to speak, before I started a team that, I had a big book of past clients and I had always done a pretty decent job of making sure we had great relationships and were in touch with them. So as the team kind of grew, and as we focused on listings more, as I started to focus on listings more, I kind of decided that every listing needs to produce buyer leads. Now I have this buyer specialist, I need to produce her leads. So we would really try hard to go for the marketing angle. We weren't really prospecting based, we were more marketing based. So when those leads would come in just off of organic marketing through social media or just, through Zillow even, I mean, just having great photography, great marketing elements, we would just make sure we convert those leads. I mean, that was always my secret as an individual agent too, was converting. I mean, I think a lot of agents, especially these last couple of years that we've come through, just there's so many leads being thrown at them and they're just kind of letting them bounce off and picking and cherry picking. And that's not really the way to, I think anybody can have a really big business without just paying for random leads. You're going to get inquiries, and those inquiries are the gold, right? So you just have to be great at follow-up. So for us, that's a high part of our standard is just follow-up, accountability. And also, honestly, this is so old school, but just open houses. When it was just me and her, that was our team's number one lead source, was holding our own listings open and converting those buyer leads that came through those open houses. I think a lot of agents are quick to say, oh, every person has an agent. That's not true. That is absolutely not true. And it's your best way to meet ready, willing, and able buyer leads. So we don't pay for any leads. I say that we do Google, like we have a Google business page and we do pay Google monthly, but we hardly get any leads from that. We don't do Zillow. We don't do any sort of paid leads. We're just generating them from marketing our own listings. And now, we do have more agents than just me and her. I don't sell anymore at all, actually. But our listing agents are very prospecting heavy. So our buyer's agents, not so much. They just do open houses and they follow up with leads and make sure they're being converted. And our listing agents do prospect for listings, but that's our main strategy, is just marketing our listings.
Simplicity is brilliance, right? Because if it works, it works. So there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. Open houses are definitely the easiest way to find a ready, willing, and able buyer because somebody walking in that door, they tend to be wanting to buy a house, or they might be a neighbor, a nosy neighbor that might be selling in the future. So, open houses are a tremendous strategy. Is there anything crazy you guys do with the open houses? Are you the type of person that throws up 50 signs and lots of pre-marketing?
No, I would say it's basic. Obviously we get them to sign in, and then we have a process that happens after we have those sign-ins. It's more about the follow-up. It's not about any crazy tactic at the open house or anything like that. And I can't tell you with honesty that we do anything consistent pre-marketing. Yes, sometimes we do circle prospecting. Yes, sometimes we do door knocking. Yes, sometimes we do mailers, but there's no consistent program that we're running other than really good marketing and making sure our homes are priced right and that they look better than they are. That's really the trick. Great staging, great photos.
So, I mean, essentially for your buyer's agents, you're leveraging your listing inventory and you're putting them in open houses. For your listing agents, I'm assuming they're doing a lot of cold calling or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, again, we do have organic business that's coming in. We have a database of 8,000 people, and we do what's called a 36 touch program. So, it's multimedia attempts to stay in touch with our database throughout the year, client events, all of those things you might traditionally hear about. So we're running all of those programs parallel to the prospecting efforts. So we get some organic flowing in that are just past clients, referrals, SOI. And then also we've just recently shifted because obviously we're in a different market now. So right now we're going heavy on expireds. That's going to be our strategy for this year. And really last year it was more about database and just procuring referrals.
All that stuff really works. So you mentioned the changing market. Tell me how your market feels now. So, I mean, I'll even preface this by giving you an idea how mine is. I'm in the suburbs of Chicago. We're 1.7 months supply, and it's kind of slow. Um, it's kind of slow, especially compared to 6 months ago, right? So we probably lost about 10% on value over the peak in like May. So I'm just curious comparatively, and obviously I didn't put you this beforehand, so you don't have to be perfect and on the dot here, but kind of give me an idea what your market's looking like.
Yeah, I don't have any exact stats for you, but essentially we we just had a multiple offer in our newest listing. So it's still happening for a certain price point. What we've really seen is a drop in the luxury type of market. That has gotten very, very, very quiet. But in general, if something looks good in its price rate, it's still selling. It might be instead of 4 days average, we're probably, this isn't reflected in numbers yet because it really hasn't, there hasn't been enough time for the numbers to release to reflect this. But I would say on average now we're looking more like 15 days, 20 days, and that's going to get worse and worse and worse. I think we might get a little blip from a spring market that we usually do, but I think next summer is going to be pretty dreary. But we don't, I mean, the biggest thing is mindset with that. Like we're excited for that because from our perspective, it's just going to be, there's less business to go around and there's more people going for it. But we have the experience and the talent and we know what we're doing. And we're going to just use this time to try to take market share and come out of whatever this downtime is with even more market share on the flip side. So it doesn't, a market like this doesn't scare us. It just will show you who is actually willing to work and who is not. And that's okay because, if people aren't willing to work, then next.
Absolutely, 100% agreed. I'm not scared at all. I'm excited. I would love for it to crash because if that happens, that's like the best opportunity in the world to buy assets and stuff like that. And not only that, but you're going to see a large amount because we're very high. I think we're historically high in realtors right now. And if the market corrects, obviously there's not going to be enough business for all of them. So a lot of them are going to disappear, which actually leaves more room for the people that are doing the work, as you just said. So brilliant.
Totally. Exactly.
So I got to get into this because you mentioned you started investing as well. So you said you had nothing and now you have a $5 million net worth after having nothing for over 15 years. That's amazing. What is your investing strategy if there's only one?
Just get started is like find a way to make that. Yeah. Find a way to make that first purchase happen. I don't care if it's a trailer. It does not matter. Like our first purchase was $59,000. And today it's worth maybe 200,000, but we've rented it since 2009 every single year, starting at 700 a month, and now the rent is 1,400 a month. We've paid it off in that time frame, and it's like this huge cash flowing asset that was only $59,000. Nothing special, nothing fancy, nothing sexy, nothing. Just start somewhere, and to buy that, we borrowed $5,000 from my husband's grandfather. And because I knew we wouldn't get approved for a loan, I scoured at the time Craigslist for a owner financing situation on $59,000. So I don't like to hear people say, oh, they can't do it. They can't blah, blah, blah. Like it doesn't, no excuses. Just figure something out and do it and start there. And so we bought that first one in 2009. We didn't buy our next investment property till 2013. We didn't have any extra money. Like it just wasn't happening. So we bought the next one. It was $94,000 today. That one's probably worth $330,000 and we rent it for $2,250 a month and we owe nothing on it. So it's like these little steps turn into big steps. It's almost like compounding interest in a way, but from a property standpoint, as long as you're taking action. The worst thing you can do is take no action, or get caught up in trends, even like I think people are oftentimes overpaying for Airbnbs because they don't really understand the value of the real estate and they're using like a commercial formula or an investor formula. And that's okay, but just you have to be prepared for the risk that you're taking from the market standpoint should regulations or things change. So that's my advice is just start somewhere, no matter how small. If it's cash flowing at all, don't worry about metrics and how much and percentages. If you're cash flowing $100 a month and that's all you can do right now, then do it and just start.
0 to 1 is the hardest one. One of the guests we had recently is just like, if you just buy a house every year, even if there's no appreciation and no, what are the other words? and no cash flow, it's still worth it over 30 years because somebody else is going to pay off that mortgage for you. And all of a sudden you have this asset. So yes, just go out there and get started. What I loved about what you said is you were scouring Craigslist for seller financing. I think seller financing, anybody that knows seller financing in the next 6 to 18 months has a massive opportunity over people that don't know it. Because as the market declines, this becomes a strategy that becomes more and more appealing.
Yeah, yeah. And it's, I think people get scared, they're just, they don't know what they don't know and they're just afraid to get taken advantage of. But it's not that scary. It really isn't. If you have the right team, I mean, I live in New York and this property we bought was in Florida. I mean, I flew down there. I was actually pregnant with my first child. I flew down there. I met with the guy. I went to a title company and I said, how do I do this? How do we write a private mortgage? I made sure I had a legitimate person doing that. I mean, you just have to figure it out and you have to have your hands in everything. Don't trust people to do it all for you. Take action and go figure it out. But if you do that and you're willing to do that, get your hands dirty a little bit, like it's not scary. It's really not. And it's up to you to take advantage of situations. They're not going to come to you.
Precisely. You got to go out and get it. That is for sure. So Christine, obviously you've done a lot of cool stuff. You've built up this massive real estate team. You've built up this awesome portfolio. What is your vision for 2023? We just passed New Year's. I'm sure you got some goals. I'd love to hear some of them.
This is an interesting time for me because 2021 was the first time I got out of production. So I've been going through like an identity crisis the last year, really, is how it feels. It's almost like, like an Olympic athlete might describe after they leave their sport and they're like thrown into the world, like, what do I do now? And that's kind of how what I've been working through the last year because now that my team is a business, and when I say that, I just mean that I'm not really trading my time for money anymore. It's just happening on its own. I work in it because I choose to, but I don't really need to. I mean, I'm 42 years old. I could retire tomorrow and it would be fine. But because I don't know anything else except that pace of like being completely moving every minute of the day, it's been a real challenge. So my goals like this next year are more about like figuring out like what's next for me personally, because I feel like the business is at a place now where it's running, it's producing, the assets in terms of the properties are running, they're producing. I got into syndications this year, so like now I feel like I'm moving into that investor quadrant because now money's working while you sleep type of thing. So it's all like amazing, and I have so much like gratitude for everything that is happening in my life, and now it's just kind of what's next, what can I do to make sure, like a big focus for me is my children now, because obviously I spent all those years not really being around, and I'm really lucky because they're only 13 and 9, so now they have a mom that's here as if I was just a regular, that's going to sound terrible, a regular stay-at-home mom. They're not going to remember those years where I was busting my butt and sending them off to daycare and to their dad every weekend. Like, they're not going to remember that. So it's kind of nice to be able to be around for them now. So as far as my team, like my goal is always that all the members of my team, are well compensated. I don't want people on my team that are making $20,000. Like, that's not exciting for me or them. I want them to be making six figures plus always. I want to teach them how to, grow their own wealth. And I love teaching and speaking. I mean, that's why I'm here today. I've been doing a lot more of that. That kind of fills my bucket now that I'm not working with clients anymore. And so, yeah, so that's my agenda for the next year.
I think that's the perfect model, essentially. Build a business that gives you active income, remove yourself from that business, and then start investing so that you can get passive income. And then it's like you have an active business that's providing income for you, and then you have a passive business just in case something goes wrong. There's really nothing that could go wrong there. So I love what you're doing there. We'd love to ask this question. If you had $1 billion and 100 lifetimes of cash flow coming in every month, what would you be doing with your time?
Traveling all over the world. I mean, that's probably such a cliche answer, but if I didn't have to think about a dollar ever again, I would just be seeing the world.
There's no such thing as cliche here. I mean, we're trying to get what Christine thinks. And if you want to travel, that's amazing. Go travel. I mean, that's what you're working so hard for, right?
That's what freedom is not having to worry financially, about anything, and being able to just do what you choose to do every single day. So I think that is why I work so hard and why I've been so purposeful about everything, is to build to this sort of moment in time where it's, it's not perfect yet, and I'm certainly not a billionaire, but it's at the point where it feels free. I feel the freedom.
Well, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. This is the Freedom Chasers podcast. So that's what we're all about. We're all about finding freedom. So thank you so much, Christine Marchesiello, for giving us a glimpse into your business. And to those of you out there chasing freedom, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Engagement is like gold dust. We can't do what we're doing without it. Reviews and subscriptions, particularly on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube, are worth more than money. So please do what you can to support the show. And remember, freedom is acquired one action at a time. Pick no more than 3 of the strategies that we discuss on this show and take massive action. Tell somebody you know that can hold you accountable. And before you know it, you too will be living a life of freedom. So thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next one.